It's like sometimes the biggest stories are the ones we just don't see, hidden,
Yeah.
right there inside us.
Yeah, like a secret code, ourselves talking, and we don't even know it.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, that's where we're headed. It's an incredible story, almost, I don't know, mystical is the word that keeps coming to mind.
I get that.
It's about a woman, Henrietta Lacks, and the things scientists found out about her cells.
It really does kind of blur the lines, like where does biology stop and something bigger begin?
Right. It makes you think about life, what we leave behind, and the impact one person can have. But don't worry, we're not going to get all super technical on you.
No, no. The human side of this is just as important. Anyone listening, whether you're a science buff or just curious, we're going to break this down.
Think of it like unlocking the secret world inside us, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary. And that's where HeLa cells come in.
That's a good way to put it. And to really get this, we got to start with Henrietta herself, born Loretta Pleasant back in 1920, Roanoke, Virginia.
Okay, so Loretta, but everyone called her Henrietta. Already there's a little mystery right from the start.
It's true. And after her mom passed, her family moved to Clover, Virginia. Then later in Halifax, she married her cousin, David Day Lacks.
Married her cousin.
Yeah, and it's more complicated than that. They'd basically grown up together, like siblings, after Henrietta went to live with his grandparents when she was just 4. But they did eventually marry in 1941, after their first 2 kids were born.
Wow. So life took them north then, right? Like so many families back then looking for opportunity.
That's right. They went up to Maryland in 43. David got a job at the Sparrows Point shipyard. Ended up in Dundalk, which was at the time becoming a big community for African Americans outside Baltimore.
And their family kept growing too. 5 kids in total.
Yep, Lawrence, Elsie, David Jr. called Sonny Deborah, and then Joseph, who later changed his name to Zachariah Bari Abdul Rahman.
5 kids. And it's kind of sad thinking about their youngest, Joseph. Born at Johns Hopkins in November of 1950. Just a few months before Henrietta got the diagnosis that changed everything. And Elsie, their daughter. Her story is particularly heartbreaking.
Yeah, Elsie had developmental challenges. The family said she was different. And tragically, around 1950, the same time Henrietta started having her own health problems, Elsie was placed in Crownsville State Hospital. She died there in 1955. And years later, the family learned how awful conditions were in those institutions back then.
Man, it's a lot to process. You've got this family living their lives, dealing with things nobody expects, and then all of a sudden, this whole self-story starts to unfold. It all kind of begins on February 1st, 1951. That's the big turning point.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Henrietta had been to New York for polio treatment, and when she came back, she went to Johns Hopkins complaining about this lump on her cervix and bleeding that just wasn't right. That's when he told her, cervical cancer.
And even then, like right off the bat, something about the tumor itself seemed strange to the doctors.
Absolutely. Dr. Howard Jones, the gynecologist who saw her, he said it just didn't look like any other tumor he'd come across.
Yeah.
Looking back, that's a huge clue, right? This wasn't going to be an ordinary case.
Now, here's where things get a little tricky. For listeners today, it's important to remember that back then, taking tissue samples during a diagnosis for research, that was just standard practice. And a lot of times, patients didn't even know it was happening.
The crazy thing is, they took samples for research before Henrietta even started treatment for the cancer. About a week later, during a checkup, Dr. George Otto Gay took another sample from the tumor. And that sample, that's what became the HeLa cell line.
I mean, back then it was normal, but thinking about it now, it brings up all sorts of questions, right, about ethics and all that. But we'll come back to that later. So after the diagnosis, Henrietta starts treatment, radiotherapy.
Right, several days of it. That was the go-to for cervical cancer in 51. She went back for more treatments later, but things just kept getting worse.
Despite all that, her health just went downhill fast. They even misdiagnosed her at one point. Thought it might be complications from a venereal disease, gave her antibiotics.
It's tragic. Nothing seemed to help. The pain got worse. She was admitted to Johns Hopkins on August 8th, stayed there until the end. Blood transfusions, more treatment, but nothing worked. She passed away on October 4th, 1951, only 31 years old. Renal failure from the cancer spreading.
Gone way too young. And to add to it all, she's buried in an unmarked grave in Laxtown. No one even knows the exact spot. But even as her life ended, something amazing was just beginning inside those cells.
This is the part that's almost hard to believe. Unlike any cancer cells Dr. Gay had seen before, Henrietta's cells, they didn't die off in the lab. They kept growing, multiplying.
Yeah, totally unheard of at the time, right? Most cells, you take them out of the body, they last a little while, divide a few times, then that's it. But not Henrietta's cells. They were different.
Exactly. Dr. Gay knew he was onto something huge. He named the cell line HeLa, from the first two letters of her first and last name. And what made them so revolutionary, and still does today, is this. They don't have the limits that other human cells have when it comes to dividing. It's like they're immortal, biologically speaking.
Immortal. It's a word you'd think belongs in, like myths and legends. But there it was, happening in these human cells. And those immortal HeLa cells, they had a massive impact on the world.
Huge understatement. Think about this. It's estimated over 70,000 scientific experiments worldwide have used HeLa cells. 70,000. It's mind-boggling how much research these cells have made possible.
And we're talking advances in so many different areas, too.
Right, absolutely. One of the first big ones was Jonas Salk's polio vaccine. HeLa cells, they were the perfect way to grow the polio virus, so they could test the vaccine.
And that was basically the beginning of like mass-producing human cells, wasn't it? Scientists everywhere realized how valuable HeLa cells were.
Right on the money. But it goes way beyond polio. HeLa cells have been essential in research on cancer, AIDS, the effects of radiation, toxins, you name it.
Yeah.
They even used them to see how humans react to everyday stuff, like glue or makeup.
The scale of it is crazy. 20 tons of HeLa cells estimated to have been grown since they were discovered. Over 11,000 patents involve them. That kind of puts it in perspective.
And the breakthroughs. It's a list that just keeps going. The first human-mouse hybrid cells, the breast cancer drug Herceptin, even progress in gene therapy, treatments for Parkinson's, leukemia. Other cells were a part of all that.
It's incredible, this legacy all stemming from cells taken from a woman who never even knew the impact she'd have. And then there's the family finding out about all of this way later.
Yeah, it wasn't until the 70s that scientists reached out to the Lax family. They needed blood samples to study the family's genes in relation to the HeLa cells. That's when the family learned about these cells still alive and being used from Henrietta decades ago. Can you imagine hearing that about your mother, your wife?
It's hard to even wrap your head around, right? To find out a piece of someone you love is out there, being used in labs, and you had no idea.
Understandably, the family had a lot of questions. It really sparked a conversation about the ethics of it all. Taking those cells without consent, what that means, the whole issue of who owns biological material, big stuff.
That conversation is still going on today, too. Consent, privacy, it's all connected to this story. And for a long time, Henrietta was just HeLa, anonymous. But thankfully, people started to recognize her and what she contributed.
It's so important that they did. Back in '96, Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, they honored Henrietta, acknowledged her contribution. Then a BBC documentary came out in '98, brought the story to even more people.
And even more recently, in 2021, the World Health Organization gave a posthumous award to Henrietta. Her son and other family members were there to receive it. It felt like a really important step, acknowledging how her race had been left out of the story for so long.
And we can't forget the other people involved. Mary Kubitschek, she was the lab assistant who first saw Henrietta's cells thriving outside the body. Dr. George Gay and his wife, Margaret, a nurse, they dedicated years to figuring out how to grow human cells. Dr. Gay even said he hoped that studying these amazing cells would lead to a cure for cancer.
So here we are at the end of this deep dive, and it's hard not to be amazed by this whole thing. Cells from an ordinary woman showing this almost mystical ability to survive, and they've changed the way we understand our bodies and disease.
It really makes you think about how connected life is. Henrietta Lacks, just by being herself, she had this huge impact on science and how we understand what it means to be human. And it leaves us with a question. What other incredible things are hidden inside us, waiting to be discovered?
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? It's a reminder to keep asking questions, to stay curious about the world inside us and the one around us. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.